Hello, everyone, and welcome to the internet's premier Korean skincare and metaphor refantasio podcast. It is, of course, the Furidashi podcast, where we talk about sunscreens, retinol, all of those things like collagen, all the things that make your skin nice and plump and beautiful and protect you from the sun so that you don't get skin cancer. I am here with my dermatologist, Lauren. Say hello to everybody.
Hello, everybody. My name is Lauren Ash. I am a certified dermatologist here, and specifically Korean beauty products. It really is about protecting your skin, not only from the sun, but also ensuring that all of our pasty people like me get appropriate amounts of vitamin D, which apparently, according to my doctor, is only 10 minutes. Yes, you heard me. 10 minutes of sunshine. That's not entirely true for me, as I am not just a pasty pea, but I also have some chalupa inside of me. And so that means that I can actually spend a whole, you read it, 20 minutes. Whoa. But with Korean skincare, you can spend maybe perhaps an hour without getting burned. So in today's show, we will be talking about bodies, which is why we are talking about sunscreen and how one can protect their body from each other in this beautiful, say, shell where we may all just be ghosts. Nicholas, please take it away with the true introduction.
Hello, everyone. Sorry for the head fake there. It's just regular Furidashi. We're talking about anime like we have been throughout the course of this year. We're talking about aesthetics. We're talking about visuals. We're talking about music. We're talking about all of the fun, less like mechanic-y things about games, about media, so that way you can all go out and create art in the world, maybe, or just have a better appreciation for the things in your life that you know and love. Today's subject will be the 1995 film by Oshii Mamoru, based on the comic by Shiro Masamune, Ghost in the Shell, or in Japanese, Koukaku Kiroutai. I'm not going to explain what that means. So the reason why I wanted to do this film, because really I chose this, was one, because I want to contrast Oshii with a director that we're going to be talking about basically at the very end of this year, at the end of this season, which is Miyazaki Hayao. And also to sort of like look at the cyberpunk genre not from the perspective that people often do, which is to sort of think of it like in sort of grand philosophical terms, very abstract notions of identity and consciousness and so forth, and actually think about the concrete in cyberpunk, like the physical body. What is the physical body meant to be? What does it represent? Like, how do the characters in these worlds interact with their own bodies? We talked about this a little bit in regard, actually not a little bit, a lot of it in regard to Cyberpunk Edge Runners, where the body there was sort of like this thing that was sort of like it was like a Bildungsroman of the body, like this thing that you're constantly trying to improve, constantly trying to get better, and then sort of like the tragedy that results, especially for David, as a result of his desire to ever trying to like increase and be more and more and more than what he was. Whereas now we're going to be looking at a film where that logic is kind of inverted, I think. We'll get into sort of specifically why I think that is, but that's our subject for today.
And I, once again, absolutely love Ghost in the Shell. If you've ever like talked to me about it, or you've ever talked to me about, say, like AI, artificial intelligence, like in manga, anime, you also probably actually don't know. I've never brought this up on the podcast before, but I am a huge Sword Art Online fan, despite all of its terrible problems in the anime. And I keep saying things like despite their problems, right? Because I think that there is a lot of problematic kind of specific things that we're going to talk about with Ghost in the Shell as well.
Yeah.
But as someone who just absolutely loves the idea of an anime or any series, maybe particularly now, even more relevant, of kind of romance, sexuality in an age where you can have a relationship with something that isn't real,
Yeah.
like an AI chatbot. This is all just, it's not new, right?
No.
These ideas have been around forever. And you could say in some instances, right? This is not to create like a debate, this is to create a discussion, right? So while I am going to say there's like a dividing line between, yes, I do believe that I could have a relationship with a robot or an AI versus no, I couldn't have a relationship with humanity. I think all of this, right, then comes down to the fundamental question of, well, why could you not, right, have that type of perception and understanding of what makes like a human body real? Or
Yeah.
what makes you human? Like ultimately, right? This is why it's a discussion. Um, it's a very derelict question of figuring out the different aspects of, right, are we the sum of our information, is that all we truly are,
Yeah.
or do we have this fundamentally natural, right, connection to our physical human fleshy form,
Yeah.
right? We talked about that in Cyberpunk Edge Runners, like Nicholas said. And for me, when then we then looked at Ghost in the Shell, Cyberpunk Edge Runners could not have existed without Ghost in
Oh
the
yeah.
Shell.
Yeah.
Just factually, I was going to say in my opinion, but
I
honestly,
think
it's not even my professional opinion. I think it's
Western
factually.
cyberpunk really couldn't exist without this film.
Yeah,
Like it's
Western cyberpunk could not exist without this film. And the reason why everybody has this obsession with Hong Kong
yeah.
in cyberpunk like could not have existed without this film. Maybe the world's obsession with Hong Kong, which I've still never been and would love to go because of, the Western obsession with Hong Kong. I mean, Q Britain. Sorry. Tangent. Uh, but I think it's really important for everyone to realize that because it's so easy for us to look at a genre and say
Yeah.
this has always existed. And it's even more easy for us on Blue Sky to go, man, look at all of our cyberpunk authors that used to say that this was something that we needed to avoid, but now is happening in reality. I'm like, excuse me, those were Eastern philosophies that were then taken by Western authors. And also, they were trying to make those happen in the East in some veins, right?
Yeah.
Like they
Yeah.
have been um, with the 2016, as an example, I'll give an example later. This is just the intro. But uh, it's just philosophy wars are fun. So this is not for war. This is not for philosophical debates. It is just to remember that Ghost in the Shell is a transcendent piece of media that we need to kind of understand and then we get to talk about here. So I'm very excited for the rest of this episode today.
Yeah. So should we just dive in?
I think we should just dive in because I
Okay.
was almost about to dive in and then I had to remember we're still in the first 5 minutes of the show. So
Yeah. So I along the lines of what Lauren said about sort of like both talking about something analytically, critiquing it, maybe like exposing what is good about it, but also at the same time, maybe possibly not even liking it. I should note that I have gone through long periods in my life where I do not like this film, mostly for its abstract philosophical crap. I don't think it's smart. I don't think it's interesting. Um and I've always tried to find, but I've often had to teach this film. I've taught the manga that it's based on. So I have at least tried to set that aside to be like, okay, so what is important? What is interesting about this? And one of the things that I was struck by recently when I was looking into sort of like, reading blog posts, reading academic articles, reading just like any discourse that I could find about this film, something that has emerged basically since, well, not terribly recently, but sort of recently, is this idea of thinking about like Kusanagi and what she goes through in this film as a kind of allegory for trans becoming. And that much of the experiences that she has with her own body, her own feelings about it being not quite right, or like there's something wrong with it, despite the fact that it's like this idealized thing, that a lot of trans individuals really sort of take this to heart and really sort of like identify with what the character is going through. And I found that really kind of fascinating because the film is not actually trying to be that. The film
yeah,
like it has no intention to be that whatsoever. But yet in sort of like this more like reader response oriented like approach, it's important to sort of look at the ways in which like Oshii's film visually is saying things that maybe he didn't necessarily intend, and yet nevertheless are there. And they're the kinds of things that people can latch onto because, you know, even though there's a lot about sort of like the experience of gender dysphoria that is specific, it also is generalizable in certain ways as well, where like the feeling of not being oneself, wanting to transform oneself, and that for trans people in particular, the fact that like that transformation is very much focused on how they feel within their own bodies. I think there's clear resonance there, even if Oshii himself didn't necessarily intend that. And so that's why
Yeah.
I really wanted to focus on like the visual and the embodied, literally, aspects of what is going on in this film.
Yeah, I honestly, I love that because what we try to do every year on the podcast around this time, as you know, it is Pride Month,
Yep.
and Nicholas and I absolutely not only love the queer community, but are also a part of the queer community. And so for us, we've always tried to just educate people and point them, right, to different amazing experiences like, right, on itch.io, what's your gender? Just
Oh
going to
my
pull
god, I'm
that
so glad you brought up that game. I love that game so much.
I absolutely bring up that game all the live long time. There is this fantastic demo I played at GDC from a trans Brazilian author, well, slash game developer, whatever. She can be an author, um, and it was just absolutely an unapproachable, grotesque level design. And I was like, I really love your game. It's so hard to play. And she's like, this is the trans experience. And I was just like, fuck, you've nailed it. And I love everything about it. I immediately threw it into the hands of everybody else. It was an experience. And so if you are listening to this, like, please keep playing your game, like making your game. Um, and I think that this is really important also for another really strong word that Nicholas brought up that I want us all to remember, which was the reader response theory,
Yeah.
right? I think what's really, really important is a lot of the times in critique and in analytics, we go into two very kind of clear things. And I say in fandom particularly. We go into this is what the author meant, like Oishi wanted X. So obviously
Yeah.
that must be the critique, like its authorial intent is all that it is.
Yeah.
But then it's going to completely destroy, right? Maybe like a really genuine reading they have. And I actually loved Ghost in the Shell because I myself, as like a woman who has been told has like the mind of a man, which is then a different problem in of itself, I definitely did not feel always kind of connected to my own body, right? There are times,
Yeah.
especially when it's like, okay, I really want to do this, but my female body is like, you've got to sit on the couch all day today. And I'm like, but
Yeah.
please, I have a deadline, right? Or please,
Yeah.
I just want to go outside and walk,
Yeah.
right? And I think that it's regardless of what gender, right, you are, or regardless if you are trans or not, this is ubiquitous. This is something that I think everyone kind of understands. So actually being able to read it through this trans allegory, Nicholas, like I'm super curious because for me, this was just more about, well, how do I feel in my body? Or is a body human or not? Now you're going like, I am human. But when
Yeah.
I transform my body, right, are you becoming truer to yourself, right?
Yeah.
Or not?
So I picked out 4 scenes that I think we can go back and forth between. But in one of them, let's see if I can find this in the notes real quick. Again, I did the thing that I always do, which is I have far too many notes. So actually, all the way to the end of the film, strangely enough. So at the end of we're going to spoil it. I'm sorry. Like it's an old film. It's a really old film. If it's 30 years
It's
old
like
now. Come
it's like the 80s. Yeah.
on. Come on, please. Like if you haven't seen
Wait,
it yet, I'm sorry.
it is in the 80s, right?
No, 30 years old. It's 95. That's
It's
the other reason
95.
why.
Okay.
That's the
Okay.
other
You're
reason why I
right.
wanted to do it because it's 30 years now. Um, in the very end of the film, in one of my favorite, I always laugh when I see this because Kusanagi fights a tank, and it's very the scene is very somber. Like there's the music, the orchestration is extremely subdued. You just see some like occasional drumming, like some like jingling sounds that I can't really identify, and she is essentially attacking a tank but not really attacking it so much as like trying to get it to use up all of its ammunition so that she can climb on top of it and like rip the tank open in order to like stop it. But the thing, because the person that she's trying to find, the puppet master who has been like embodied in this like female torso that Section 9, the agency she works for, has found, is in a car underneath where this tank sits. So she's got to deal with the tank first. And in that moment where she's like ripping the hatch or trying to rip the hatch off the tank, like you see her muscles like ripple and flex so intensely that you can actually like see the striations of her muscles through her skin. And the reason why that is not necessarily just because she's straining, but also because literally as a result of this thing that she's doing, she tears her own body apart. Like her the skeleton, like her leg, uh like artificial bones like come like popping through. She literally ends up ripping her arms off as a result of this, and is rendered helpless as a result. And so there is this kind of like expression of like the power of this body that she has, but then also through it she renders herself helpless. And there is this tension then between sort of like what she wants to become, which is actually something other than what this body kind of like. There's a path in life that her body wants her to take, and then there is a path in her life that her ghost or her sense of self wants to take. And in order to sort of like realize that desire, the one that she has in her specific like person, almost requires the destruction of this
Yeah.
like quote unquote perfect body. And to go back to sort of like the question of the trans allegory, there is this idea that like you live in this body that you always feel kind of both part of, like that it's a fundamental contradiction, because you feel part of it, you feel imprisoned by it, you feel trapped by it, but you also feel kind of aloof and distant from it at the same time. And there has to be a breaking of that impasse, but the contradiction is really fundamental. The contradiction, like visually in the film, between this incredibly strong powerful body but that is then rendered helpless, the contradiction between the fact that like Kusanagi is constantly like repeating these moments in her life, or at least we assume because we see the scuba diving scene, where like she's trying to recreate this feeling of like floating and emerging in water, when that's actually something her body can't do by itself, because of the fact that it's mostly artificial, as Bato says when they're later on the boat, that if she just allowed her body to be what it is, she would literally sink to the bottom of the ocean. So there's this sense that like she needs to intervene to sort of like refashion this body into something that better represents who she feels she is. And that is a violence perpetrated on it. And trans people often talk about the experience of gender dysphoria as a kind of violence that is perpetrated on them, as something that is like, as Lauren, you said, like that very game that you had mentioned, where the very metaphor of what the trans experience is an experience of impossibility, or not, maybe not
Yeah.
impossibility, but
No, but
extreme
it's
difficulty.
it's the feeling and the yeah, extreme difficulty I think is better, but also it is almost in an impossible, say, area to navigate is what I think the author of the game really nailed for me.
Yeah.
Because I think at times, regardless of whether or not we identify as trans, and I actually have a lot of my friends have also identified as trans or in the process of transitioning right now. And I think that it's the difficulty of both having to go through it,
Yeah.
because to get to the other side, it's not going to be any more or less difficult. You are just going to be like more you, I think
Yeah.
is the point. And I think, funnily enough, to kind of also look at the tank, right? Kind of go back to that scene before we kind of talk about the boat scene necessarily, because I actually have more to talk about there.
Okay.
To kind of wrap up the kind of tank scene about that kind of destruction of the body. I think once again, right, if we look at the author's like intent or like the visuals of that scene, a very Oishi thing to do when she's actually ripping her flesh, like let's remember that this wasn't, say, intended to be the trans allegory. So when we look at the scene from like his perspective, he's going, she's about to become no longer attached to a body that, quite frankly, she
Yeah.
has. The reason why this ties in so well to the boat scene is that she has stated it is not her own. It is
Oh
not
yeah. Yeah.
Kusanagi's body. It is like the corporation's body, right?
Yeah.
And I think that then Batu also, right, in once again in the boat scene, also then talks about, well, it's both our brains and our bodies are owned by the corporation, which then seeds, right, in that I wouldn't say I don't want to talk about the doubt yet, but which absolutely seeds in Kusanagi's kind of ideal that she's like, I can trash this body because
Yeah.
it is not my body, but also she has like the ability to kind of take that risk, right, upon herself, render herself helpless. Um, so that it's like defeating the tank at all costs, trying to get to the puppet master in that car and figuring out what mentally is she is capable of,
Yeah.
right? And her ghost is capable of. The ghost being kind of the most, say, human thing that is mentioned in the film,
Yeah.
right? Um, that's I think really, really powerful for the scene. And then for me, realizing that there is this trans reader response allegory fits so nicely because it is your ghost. It is this like ethereal part of you that you don't quite feel like is your soul, but also is that kind of aloof, like objective part that you're like, yes, this is who I am, and I'm a ghost. I'm a shade, right, of
Yeah.
my full potential. And I think that's why the word is so important as well, because it's the
Yeah.
shade of the potential that for her, she goes, my body is something you can destroy, because for her, right, as a cyborg, she can just remake it, right? Or it
Yeah.
can just be remade as long as, and this is why I was like, let's focus on this, as long as the thing that makes her human, her ghost, the human cells inside her brain, potentially like her head, right? Like that would
Yeah.
be way too much work to reanimate a new face, that, especially back in the 90s. But like her head, right, is that at the very end, the only thing that saves her is Batu sacrifices his arm
Yeah.
and it gets blown off and her neck gets blown off, but her brain doesn't.
Yeah.
And you see there is an external, potentially American force that wanted to destroy, right, not just the puppet master, but also, right, Kusanagi, who they seemed, right, deemed is like the biggest threat, right?
Yeah.
Um, and I say it could be American because earlier in the film they talk about how like the Americans just kind of want to
There's clearly
shove it all up, and
there's some collusion going on
there is some
between. Yeah.
collusion, right?
Yeah.
Because the meta
Yeah.
tech, which that was another thing, uh,
Yeah.
from America, right, is the contractor for these weaponized bodies, and that's the
Yeah.
corporation that owns, once again, right, Kusanagi's body and Batu's body as well. So I think that that particular thing, right, he has to sacrifice his body. She had to a part of his body, right? Kusanagi has to sacrifice her whole body and then eventually does sacrifice her whole body in becoming one with herself, the ghost. And in a way, you sacrifice your old body as well, I think,
Yeah.
in trans. And then you do end up embracing your body, right? And when you are reborn, right, whether you fully transition or not, you do have to embrace certain aspects of yourself. But
Yeah.
until then, you do feel like a ghost in the shell. And so I think
Yeah.
that's my kind of bow for that tank scene that's so powerful, is because originally it was just meant to be a, you sacrifice, like if you sacrifice your body, what do you gain, right?
Yeah.
But
Exactly.
yeah, and it's a man, yeah, um,
Well, yeah, because
yeah,
the
very
puppet
powerful.
master has this line about how like he's a sentient life form because he's aware of his own existence, but that he's
Mm,
incomplete because he lacks the ability to reproduce and to die. So, like, if we're looking at it just as text rather than subtext, the way to read that scene is he has to both die and reproduce in order to become a complete life form in the way that Kusanagi is already a quote unquote complete life form.
right.
I don't know if this works conceptually, but that's like what the movie is trying to tell
Yeah.
you that
And
scene means.
and exactly, and I think that's actually even more important is that she goes, yes, but you can propagate your data, you can copy yourself.
Yeah.
And he's like, no, 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 that is a copy,
Yeah.
right? Almost as it, even though he feels that he's a sentient life form because he's there, and he's like, sure, I could copy myself onto a disk, but I am aware that I am a copy,
Yeah.
right? And if you have played Cyberpunk 2077, you will know, right, that that scene, that type of allegory is incredibly powerful for the soul chip or the
Yeah.
soulgram, where they're like, oh, we're going to upload your soul because you have bought in that your soul is just data, that you are just information.
Yeah.
And we're just going to download it. We're just going to copy it, which if you've also watched the Black Mirror episode, San Junipero and others, you also know that's what they're doing as well.
Yeah.
But that implies, right, that your soul is just your ghost, is just your data, is just your mind, and that you have no bodily, say, connection,
Yeah.
right? And I think that what's interestingly is if you just read the text, he's going, he being the AI, just so we're clear, there's a male voice and a female voice. You can take with that what you will.
The puppet master, at least canonically, is supposed to be a guy, even though
It's
it's actually,
canonically supposed to be a guy, blah, blah,
yeah,
blah. Even though say blah, 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 blah. Let's move on.
yeah,
We have to move on. I don't have time to get into the gender identity theory of necessarily Ghost in the Shell at this point in time. But if you do really want to get into that with us, please head over to our Patreon and or comment on Spotify or hit us up. So just focusing on the body aspect, when he says, he's like, but I can't reproduce, right? I can't die. To him, even as the AI, he goes, a body, right? A
yeah,
life form of some sort is actually what enables that, like a actual physical kind of presence in the real world, like not the data space. And I think that just at the text level. And I
yeah,
think that's what's really powerful as well when we connect it to the fact that Kusanagi throughout the film has talked about how her body is unable to, say, reproduce life.
yeah.
Once again, the whole male interpretation of the female's womb giving experience into a
She
cybernetic
doesn't.
thing.
She doesn't have a vajayjay, therefore she can't like reproduce
Yeah,
sexually in the regular way.
in the regular way is always going to be a topic of any man that decides to make a cyberpunk film. Fine. Or even not. um, or not. And I think that I've gotten over that at this point. And I will say that right as the female of the podcast, that like I do not want children. I do not want to reproduce in that way. But that does not mean that you cannot reproduce in other ways. All of you are my children here listening to me today. And thus shall I corrupt you
Would
and
you say that
propagate my
we are
knowledge.
releasing our children out onto the net? Would you say that that's what we're
Oh,
doing?
yes, yes. Releasing our children out into the net. Final point on the tank scene to tie into the bodies and how Kusanagi feels about, right, the propagation is that then it once again, if we just read the text, is made incredibly literal because then, right, Kusanagi obviously, Batu is like, sorry, that's the only body I could get for you. But then
Yeah,
looking at herself, she is a child. And though so she
yeah,
is says in a child's voice, she responds to him.
yeah,
Only to then eventually be like, I'm an adult again. It doesn't
yeah,
matter what my body looks like. My ghost is still that of an adult,
yeah,
right? So I think that's just such a clever way of kind of really honing in on the point of what the film is textually, right? No subtext is kind of saying
yeah.
because they really wanted to make it apparent that them merging created a baby, right?
In a sense, yeah.
In a
That
sense. Yeah,
yeah.
in a sense.
Well, what's interesting is that like okay, so we talked about kind of like the surface level like diegetic explanation for like what is going on in the film. But also, I would strongly argue that the film is ironic and that it actually in fact intends to be read ironically because there are a number of really interesting and sort of productive contradictions that you see throughout the film. Well, let me see. Let me go back to my notes real quick so I can see exactly where this is. Okay. Actually, I want to talk a little bit about classical Japanese. So, in the title sequence of the film, this really, really famous title sequence where, you know, you both get the opening credits and, you know, the title crawl and so forth. We see juxtaposed with that, like interspersed within that, scenes of a body being manufactured in a manner very similar to the way in which Kusanagi's own body was likely manufactured. Now, the reason why I want to talk about it this way is because even though at the end of the title sequence, the body that is produced appears to be Kusanagi's, and then also additionally, the way it's framed is that it seems like it's meant to be that whole sequence is meant to be a dream that Kusanagi herself was having as she wakes up at the beginning of the film that later on it's implied that maybe Kusanagi's body isn't actually as unique as she and we assume it to be. And so in this opening sequence, there's this interesting juxtaposition between this like very sterile very technical production of a body literally from the inside out. We see its internal like composition first, and then sort of like layers are added to it as we go along. That juxtaposed with this sort of visual of this body being created in this very sort of like, futuristic way is this extremely old sounding music that is playing over the top of it. So not only is sort of like the style of the music very it's not. I couldn't I'm not like a scholar of Gagaku, so I don't know this for certain, but it sounds very reminiscent of various styles of like choral chanting that is common to basically any East Asian culture that is influenced by the Chinese in any way whatsoever. But there's also some like Mongolian elements to it as well. It's complicated. But the lyrics are in classical Japanese. And not only are they in classical Japanese, there's also like very explicit literary allusions to them that like in order to understand what it's saying, you have to be pretty familiar with pre-modern Japanese literature. So I am uniquely disposed to actually talk about this
Which,
because
just FYI, by the way, is like 100% a good humble brag, just so we're all clear, because that
yeah, I
is
spent a lot of
very
time in grad
specific.
school studying this stuff, so I like to
Yeah,
think like
this is your actual speciality. You can
like I
actually,
can talk
right?
about this. Yeah, and also because like most interpretations of this that I've seen online, I'm like, no, you don't understand what this is saying. So the lyrics, as I have translated them in our notes, go a little something like this: When I dance, a beautiful woman becomes or is intoxicated. When I dance, the shining moon cries out. And the verb that is used there, the reason why I translate it as cries out, because I also mean cries out in like every possible way you can interpret that, because the Japanese can also be interpreted in that way. Crying out in the sense of like wailing or like
Mhm,
weeping, but
mhm.
cry out also in the sense of like ecstasy, cry out in the sense of like, trying to plead to someone for help. Like all of those meanings are there. Sneaking into there's no good translation of this word. So yobai, no good translation. Sneaking into the bedchamber, a god descends from on high at dawn. The nuedori, or what is actually it's white's thrush, or what in Japanese is sometimes called a toratsugumi, or literally a tiger thrush, cries out, or cries, because it's just naku at the end there. Um, so this word yobai, this untranslatable word that I referred to, is something that is very specific to like medieval and like even earlier Japanese literature, where it's this practice of especially aristocratic men sneaking into a woman's bedchamber to essentially, in a somewhat rapey kind of way, coerce her into having sex with him.
Yeah, it's Zeus coming down as a serpent and being
Yeah,
like, "I love you."
exactly.
Mhm, mhm.
But in a way that's maybe not entirely consensual, maybe
Oh, no,
consensual,
Zeus was
maybe
absolutely
not
not
consensual. No,
consensual.
I'm
No,
saying
no, 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 no,
in
no.
this case, like the consensual nature of it is actually
It's
up for
more
grabs.
vague. It's
Yeah.
more vague. Yeah, okay.
So if you think about, and then the nuedori. So this is this particular phrasing to refer to this particular bird is really only seen in classical Japanese literature. The modern term is different.
Is
Um,
Yobai a bird or is it the Nudibori?
so yobai is the
Is
sneaking
the
into
god.
somebody is
Oh,
is
is
the
the
practice of sneaking into
concept.
somebody's room.
Okay.
That's why it's very hard to translate, because it's literally the
Yes.
whole like I sneak in to sort of like embarrass you into having sex with me. That's implied in all of it.
Okay, great. So that is the verb.
Readers of the Tale of Genji
Okay.
will be familiar with what this is.
Yes. Yeah, 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 yeah. I was
um,
like, this sounds like the tale of Genji. Okay, great.
okay, so
Continue with
the
the
bird
bird.
is a kind of so the cry of the nue. So the word literally refers to a bird that is a nue. A nue is this like chimeric creature in classical Japanese mythology, but that's not super relevant. What is relevant is that the way in which this word is typically used in Japanese poetry, especially, is to reference someone who is like experiencing profound loneliness. And so like the crying out part that I alluded to earlier, like, so there's this, we imagine that there is this beautiful woman and a god is like sneaking into her bedchamber. The god is maybe the eye in this case, it's unclear. And that, so then like what is this analogous to? Well, in many ways, the puppet master has been seeking after Kusanagi for a very long time. and in a sense is insinuating himself into her life and sort of like sneaking up on her and into her like consciousness and her awareness to procreate with her. And so like there is a very vague sexual component to all of this, but it's extremely literary. And so like those four lines are what are used as the accompaniment for this scene, which is all about the production, like in a very capitalistic sense, of this mechanized body. And so the film from the very beginning, from the title sequence, is presenting you with a contradiction. It's presenting you with the futuristic visual of this this humanoid body being produced, while using music and lyrics to that song that are archaic. And so it's drawing from both ends at the same time to see like where these things are meeting in the middle. Like what actually is Oshii trying to say in this moment where, like, if you think about cyberpunk media typically, like what kind of music is usually used? You get your heavy metal, you get your techno, you get your electronic dance music. Like these genres are extremely well worn when it comes to sort of like cyberpunk media in general. Whereas a song like this is something you never hear in this context. And I think you really have to kind of sit with that fact, which is that like, so, the consciousness that is referred to throughout the film is this thing called a ghost, which Shiro defines in his comic, but Oshii doesn't really do much to define here. And I think the non-definition is important because the ghost is supposed to be understood both as having a technological component as well as a like profound ancient spiritual one. And those two things are normally understood as being like in conflict with one another. Whereas here, what the film, at least in Kusanagi's person, is trying to resolve is to say that maybe that's not actually a contradiction. Maybe there is a way to resolve this in the same way that like trans people try to resolve the fundamental conflict of their identity by pushing forward to something that is new, by like actually redefining the terms of what gender is. The point of being trans is not to sort of just accept like received masculinity and received femininity and reproduce them, but to sort of like understand the reception of like the gender spectrum and to produce in oneself something that actually fundamentally undermines it. And that's actually what Kusanagi is doing as well. Like the thing that she and the puppet master produce together as an identity at the end of the film is something fundamentally other to what has come before. It is neither one nor the other. It is this fundamentally different thing.
And because we are, once again, like neither Nicholas or I identify as trans, I do want you to know that we are actually referencing some of the literature and kind of the actual arguments that
Yeah.
you were actually reading and research. So I just wanted to call out that for a lot of the trans allegories, there are interpretation of existing arguments out there, and I say arguments, but that's not what I mean. I meant readings of this, and I just want to point that out for any of our queer or trans listeners out there that we did our homework and are reading from what members of your community have looked at us. So we'll be including those as well within our Patreon and our notes. Now, I actually want to, I hate like putting that in as the end of the like, hey, by the way, guys, like we did our homework here.
Yeah.
It's not just Nicholas's own research and our interpretation. But I really want to hone in and build off of the critique that you were making about how that is exactly what Kusanagi and the Puppet Master are doing at the end is something that now this is, once again, I'll bring it into kind of that ubiquitousness of something that is also in Japanese culture because it has words for it, but it can very much just be described in English, right, as kind of our public persona or the face, right, that we kind of portray to others, as well as what is our true self. And that is the tatemae and the hone. The built-in front, if you will, is actually what tatemae means, right? It's you go out on public, you're ordering your cup of coffee, and someone's like, hey, you look like you want to talk to me. And I'm like, yep, that's the kind of face I have. Of course I wanted to talk to you, random stranger, before I have had my coffee. Tell me your life story. Versus the true soul is obviously meant to be read, ironically, I do not want to talk to you. I have not yet had my coffee. As jovial as my appearance is, I am actually dying inside. Please leave me alone. No. So I bring that as like a joke and as like kind of the light point, because when I look at Ghost in the Shell for me, and when I look at the argument of you're trying to not recreate, okay, or reproduce existing gender,
Yeah.
right? Or even an existing body, right? I think that's incredibly important when we look at the title sequence, because while it eventually, right, it looks like on the surface, on the text, it looks like they're recreating the human skeletal structure. They're recreating the muscles, right?
Yeah.
But bone and this metatech titanium, right, or whatever those muscles are, can kind of rip a tank.
Yeah.
I definitely, Lauren Ash, cannot rip a tank. You see?
No, you cannot.
I cannot. And the notion of like what a human body is, right, versus what this cyborg body is, and how Kusanagi, I think, and this is where we actually, I almost mentioned this, with those seeds of doubt about what she believes, right, is a kind of human experience, and what makes someone human, I think, is that fundamental connection to a non kind of automated body. And this comes up in the scene where they are, gosh, I forgot his name, but where she's driving and she's talking to someone, and she basically talks about how he is pretty much all human. And he's like, yeah, but why did you choose me to be a part of Section 9? Like, I'm not super skilled. I'm not, a cybernetic. I don't have anything special about me. And she's like, yeah, actually, that is exactly why I chose you. You're an honest cop. You're loyal. And other than, say, right, maybe a small brain implant, because it's kind of implied that everyone has that, like everyone has a ghost, she's like, you are entirely human, because his body is what makes him human. Versus she, right, and Batu and herself are so, right, separated from that they're like, our bodies aren't human, but our bodies aren't even ours anymore. I think that's
Yeah.
which she says later in the film. And to me, what I loved is that I think that's where she is already kind of implying, this is a textual reading, this is like what she says exactly herself, is that, yes, well, the argument is then I chose you because we need every type of person on our team, right? Diversity is great. Over specialization breeds weakness. She also then implies, right, like two things with that. First, that she, right, values diversity, values all of the experiences of her brain, but then she's also saying, I am less human because my body is not like actual, like physical meat space. And then it does go into the I can never reproduce because like blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
But also there's this almost dewomanizing in the film of herself as well, not just
Oh
in
yeah.
terms of
Yeah.
don't have a womb, okay? It's Kusanagi herself is like, I am not a gender, even though she has been, right, put on a gender, and her brain is like, well, I have the body of a woman, right?
Yeah.
It's kind of lightly implied. I think that it's lightly implied on Kusanagi's point. It's higher implied, right, that Batu is like interested in Kusanagi as a lady, quote
Well,
unquote. And
yeah,
it's
he
implied.
definitely he feels shame when he sees her naked. And that's
Yes, because
important.
he
Yeah.
feels exactly. That's what I'm saying. Because he feels
Yeah.
shame when he sees her naked. That is not, once again, shared by Kusanagi herself. And I think
Yeah.
that's kind of the
Yeah.
point that I'm trying to get at, is that the trans allegory for me is so strong here because Kusanagi is like, no, this is just a body. It is not mine. And yes, it looks like a woman. I don't know why they gave me nips, but they did. Okay. Versus Batu is like, I don't care why they gave you nips. Like, I, right, am a manly man. I am treating you as a woman. And every time Batu is in a scene, if she is naked, whenever she is naked, he
Yeah.
puts her jacket over her. You should not be, because it's almost as if Batu's, hold on, I'm going to get there
Yeah.
and then you
I
can
know. I'm sorry.
interject.
I'm sorry.
It's because it's almost if Batu's seeing of the front, of the built in facade of her as a woman, is projecting that femininity onto her, despite the fact that her true self, her hon, does not does not feel that way. And I think that dichotomy, constantly turning away from her when she like strips out of the wetsuit, covering her when he's like, why do you have to be naked to like apparently cloak your body, but other people can cloak their body and wear clothes, right? At the very end, she's laying there with the puppet master and his jacket is on her again, right?
Yeah.
As a child, he could have, well, I'm glad he didn't leave the child's body naked, but he could have, right? He had to dress the child's body, right? And he's like, at the very end, he's like, I'm sorry, it's the only thing I could find. Don't worry. it's not my type. I'm like, oh my God, the only thing that increases like romance and sexuality in Ghost in the Shell the movie is just Batu being like, regardless of whatever augments he's had, he's like, I am a man.
Yeah.
and I just have to talk about that with the idea of the allegory, because people see you and project onto you your gender identity
Yes.
because of the built-in, right, facade that you cannot control, regardless of if your true soul aligns with that facade or not, right? And so I think that while I feel like the argument is strong for just anyone that has gone, I wish I could change my outward appearance to be any sort of gender on the spectrum, like you were talking about, right? That it is a spectrum, right, of femininity and masculinity, or not even those two, right? Just of
Yeah.
how people view you. Is
Yeah.
that ultimately, at the end of the day, when your true self, or even if it's your personality, you project to be happy, but actually inside you're sad, or you actually project like a harsh exterior by default, and actually you're just a big soft boy, you know? I think that it's that type of projection, but it's also the projection of others that view you
Yeah.
that actually is what the Hone is fighting against consistently, and what Kusanagi really for me represented in all of this. That is only made stronger when you read it through the trans perspective. That's really what I'm getting at here.
So to yes and you, I want to point out the fact that like most of the time when Kusanagi is, aside from like the opening sequence where we don't necessarily know if that's her body or not, the times when diegetically Kusanagi is naked, there's always for a specific reason. And in each case, it's because she wants to be invisible. So let's talk a little bit about thermo-optic camouflage.
Yes, let's talk
so
about it.
so so at the very beginning of the film, the reason why she takes off her long overcoat is because as she like does this dive down the side of the building. By the way, a dive down the side of the building. I wonder if that's relevant to anything that happens later in the film. She literally causes herself to disappear. There's this really brilliant sequence where like her body sort of flashes in and out of like sight for these like guys that are in the building that are sort of looking down upon her, and she does this thing where she like takes her hand, brings it up in front of her face, and she completely disappears. So again, the irony of this text is so rich because it's like the naked female form, this thing that Lauren is 100% right, that like the film both presents it to you as this like subject of the male gaze, this thing that Bato gawks at but also feels bad about gawking at, like from Kusanagi's perspective, is something that like doesn't expose her, it does the opposite. Like she completely disappears. Like it's, and not in the sense where like the body is sort of like destroyed or eradicated, like at the end of the film, but like literally you can't see it. And then a little later on, when they're chasing that guy through the streets of not Hong Kong, the entire fight that she has with him out on the water in sort of like that shallow water, like you don't see her, you see the effect that she has upon him. And so throughout the film, Oshii is telling you that like this body, from the perspective of the individual and what she needs it to do, like her nudity is not a function, or like, okay, so like if I'm thinking of, I am Kusanagi, like what am I trying to do when I take off my clothes? When I do that, I'm not doing that to expose myself, to sort of like project my femininity and sort of like to the prurient gaze of douchebag guys. No, I am doing that to render myself unseen.
Yeah. And I
So
think
there, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, so yes, and when we look at that from that perspective, the reason why I think also this film coming out, when it did come out and in the 90s, is so powerful and is impactful, is that think about kind of the ideas that you probably have of cyberpunk right nowadays. And even actually, we can look at this in the Western's interpretation with Blade Runner, right? Of other types of films and properties that came from the East. Is that the female form, just in general, right? The woman drops her robe and she's naked, and then you see the backside of her, but not really. She's in the shadows, and then you see like the man gawking. Like that is a typical 1920s, 1950s kind of like movie kind of thing.
Yeah.
Um, And when you think of that, it's because look at me, I'm becoming vulnerable for you. I'm exposing myself to you. But this flips it, right?
Yeah.
I think that's really like the heart of the argument is that the female form, like from her perspective, is still kind of like a tool, but instead of being used to kind of excite, I guess, she's like, no, I'm going to be unseen. So then I actually subvert not just the trope of this is why I would show you my body. It's that no, my body is actually a weapon. She is at her most powerful, you could say,
Yeah.
when she is not seen, and also then when she must be rendered nude. Now, I will just really point out quick for any of the manga readers out there that uh, this argument kind of gets thrown out just a little bit because once again, males that go naked or go thermo camouflage don't have to go naked, right?
Yeah.
And Kusanagi does. So I once again, like we always do on this podcast, we do make our arguments and then we do tell you, hey, look, this is about the movie specifically. If you
Yeah.
do
Yeah.
read the manga, there's a reason like why the author wanted her to be naked. Um, may or may
Yeah.
not be a male.
Yeah. So
Yeah,
he could jerk off to her. That's why he
yeah,
wanted
and
to
that's fine.
make her naked.
But the point still stands that from Kusanagi's perspective, that we see right in the movie is that there is that lack of kind of thought about it. And I think that's what's brilliant is that truthfully, right? Like it was to be Batu is doing it, I think, and he feels shame. Shame is good here. Shame is I know that I'm projecting something you don't feel about yourself on you, but I, right, am gonna that this is how I like show respect to, right, this form. Versus just also, I think, then be desexualizing it as well. Because then we can tie that back to the Edge Runners scene, right? Where they're both being vulnerable with each other or they're being cold with each other and they're both naked for
Yeah.
David and Lucy in that. So that's kind of my like yes and to that argument as well, and a little bit more like specific text,
Yeah.
subtextual thing.
So actually, so I want to end since we have been talking about these things. I want to end the free episode with a specific reference to one of these blog posts that I read. This is on filmcred.com. This is the writer Andy. They're not identified in any other way beyond just Andy. So I'll link to it in the show notes so that way you can find it.
Perfect. Yes.
So they say that that the only way the cyborg can be real is if the human testing it can obtain evidence of their cognizance. I don't like that line, but I understand what they mean. To the human, it is not enough that the cyborg is aware of their own existence. It has to match up with the human's reality, interpretations, and perceptions. And this is what Lauren was saying earlier, that like the film is very much aware of the fact that gender is this thing that is projected onto a particular body. In this way, this is going back to the text. In this way, the cyborg can only become real if the human allows it to be. This is similar to the question that plagues Kusanagi, the haunting question that she may not be truly, quote unquote, real. It's the question that haunted me as well for so many years, and at times still does. But like Kusanagi, I came to a point that I simply didn't care anymore because I had found another way to exist. When I finally accepted and understood myself as transmasculine and really as a guy, it didn't matter that my reality didn't match with other people's perceptions of me. In other words, my awareness of my own cognizance was proof enough of my own reality. Someone else's inability to comprehend or understand my existence means nothing to me. I still exist. I am still real, even if you refuse to believe so. And so you see this play out in the film, this idea of like, fundamentally like rejecting the sort of like the projection onto the projection of gender onto your body is a transcendent experience, and one where not only do you sort of like become yourself, but you also kind of elude the hangups that society, well, you maybe not fully elude, but you begin to elude the hangups that society would want to project on you. And it's similar for Kusanagi because what state is she in at the end of the film? It's unclear whether or not she's even a part of Section 9 anymore. It's unclear what she's going to do. And her existence from that point forward, at least it's implied, will in no way resemble what she has gone through throughout the course of the film. And so the reason why I wanted to, again, bring this to the fore, this idea of like reading this film in particular as a trans allegory, as others have done, is because, not to put too fine a note on it, but like Lauren and I live in a country where trans people's very existence is not only questioned, but is being actively assaulted by state, local, and even the national government. And I think in that context, it is extremely important to affirm the value of the experiences that trans people have, the way they understand things. And I wanted to integrate it into our reading of the film as a reminder here in, Pride Month, which we're all celebrating, that I don't know, it has to be about more than just like a live and let live mentality for people who are different from you. Sometimes you also, as a cis person, need to affirm the value of other people's existences. And I think that's really kind of at the core of this film. And it's the part of it that I really like, not the part of it that annoys me. And so, Lauren, do you have anything else that you would like to add before we close out this episode?
No, I think you said everything that I could have said, honestly. That at the end of the day, it's all about not only affirming your own existence for yourself, but that we're here to affirm your existence with you. And with that, happy Pride Month, everybody. And remember, Pride exists all year long.